Welcome back to The Why. My next guest's organization believes the separation of church and state makes our country more fair, more equal, and more inclusive. Rachel Lazar is the president and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on The Why.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So why is it important to organizations like yours to uphold the principle of separation of church and state today?
Church-state separation is actually what guarantees religious freedom in this country. It's what guarantees all of our right to live as ourselves and believe as we choose. And what's implicated is our right to have reproductive care, our right to be our true selves if we're LGBTQ identified, and our right to believe and practice whatever religion we want, or to be non-religious, where we have an increasing number of Americans who identify that way too. So it's crucial to both freedom, but also to equality.
Where's the fine line in religious legal cases when the defense can claim it's freedom of expression or religion?
That's a complicated question. Freedom of religion is the freedom to believe or not as you see fit, so long as you don't harm others. And so where the courts have generally drawn the line is where people want to use their religious beliefs to license discrimination against others or to cause harm. That is unconstitutional, because that would be the government really preferring that person's religion over the person's religion who's being discriminated against. And that's not okay, because we're all equally entitled to our belief systems.
I want you to elaborate a little bit more on this for me. In an op-ed for the Chicago Tribune in 2019, you wrote that today's attacks on church and state separation are putting the lives and freedom of countless women at risk. They also are threatening LGBTQ people, religious minorities, and religious freedom for all, a seminal and foundational feature of America. Help us understand a little bit more about that.
Yes, thank you. That's really an important point. I think most people get intuitively that the abortion bans that we're seeing sort of pass all around the country, waiting for Roe v. Wade to be overturned, are very often rooted in religion. And we actually hear governors when they do their signing ceremonies, or the sponsors of the bills in state legislatures actually own the religious underpinnings as well of these abortion bans. And we know that these abortion bans actually risk women's lives and pregnant people's lives. But we also saw under the Trump administration a litany of regulations in the name of, quote, religious freedom that were giving a license to discriminate in the realm of healthcare. If a healthcare provider could claim that it violated their religious beliefs, they could deny a service or even deny serving someone. That's really a matter of life and death. We also saw regulations that allowed federal contractors to discriminate on the basis of religion, and federal contractors employ over 1/5 of the workforce in America, and that's also a matter of livelihood. Right. So we're talking about fundamentals that are at risk, and often it's LGBTQ folks, it's women, it's actually folks who are Black and brown who are being targeted. So it's a very dangerous thing when we undermine church-state separation for many of us.
5 of the last 7 Supreme Court justices have been appointed by Republicans. Does that influence how religious cases are voted on?
You know, not always and not necessarily. There have been some justices who've been appointed by Republicans who have actually been fine on church-state separation. And Sandra Day O'Connor is one of them, for example. On the other hand, what we witnessed in the Trump years were 3 appointments to the Supreme Court by who are truly extremists and would deny the importance of the separation of religion and government, which is a central tenet of the First Amendment and of democracy. So just the other day, actually, there was an oral argument that took place before the Supreme Court in the Shurtleff v. Boston case, which is about whether the City Hall flagpole in Boston has to fly the Christian flag. And in that oral argument, Justice Gorsuch actually called church-state separation so-called church-state separation, a very dangerous position for a Supreme Court justice to take.
What are the biggest arguments as to why lowering or removing that wall of separation of church and state would be beneficial to society?
Well, it's really about all of our freedom. It's about taxpayers' religious freedom and all of our religious freedom. It's about keeping the peace, right? And that's something that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who are our founders, who were really focused on separating church and state, were very in tune with, which was, you know, when there was church-state unity in Europe, there was violence and oppression. And in fact, many folks don't know that in the early days in Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, you could actually go to jail if you didn't attend church services on Sunday. And so they understood that that could arise from failure to separate church and state, and really what we've been talking about, which is equality, which is our right not only to believe as we choose, but also to live as ourselves, which gets implicated. And we see this in countries around the world where church and state aren't separated.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to religious legal cases, do the courts tend to favorably vote on all religions, or is there a lenience or favoritism toward one religion?
That's a great question, because it used to be, for example, like when the chief was Justice Warren in the many decades ago, that the cases that the court would take on religious freedom and that they would rule on were about religious minorities or about dissenters in their religion. But today, what we're witnessing, there's actually a story on it that was reported in a report on it that was part of the New York Times story, is that the majority of cases that the court is taking today that are religious freedom cases are on behalf of the mainstream religion, on behalf of Christians. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say conservative Christians, right? Because not all Christians are with the Christians who are bringing the lawsuits today. And we're facing lawsuits like one that Americans United, my organization, is defending a public school district in Washington state that wants to be able to stop a football coach from pressuring his players to pray at the 50-yard line, right? And we're dealing with basics and fundamentals. We're dealing with potentially radical departures from protections that have been in place for decades in our country that protect the religious freedom of students in public schools. So a lot of the basics are at risk today.
Okay, Rachel Lazar, thank you so much for coming on The Why and sharing that valuable insight with us on this topic. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back.